Well, I was going to congratulate you all for being here. How's the sound? Am I breathing a little too loudly into it? You probably won't have seen this because you didn't have the same vantage point as me. But as the hours went up, the age went down. It was very noticeable. So my topic today is software ethics and how we as testers can learn to survive in a world where there are a lot of ethical challenges. What prompted this talk in the first place was my interest and horror somewhat at things like the Volkswagen scandal, the emissions scandal. And in fact, of course, it's not, Volkswagen is not alone in this. The United States government is now investigating Chrysler. And it's believed that a lot of other car companies, diesel companies, will be investigated similarly and will likely be implicated in a similar scandal. Of course, there are lots and lots of other kinds of ethical challenges that we face with software, that the world faces with our software. And it's not, of course, not a new topic. I'll start by saying here's who I am. I'm not going to go through it. You have a bio. There's the stuff I do for a living. There's the other stuff I do. I'll also utter a caveat. I'm not a philosopher, so this is who I am not. I haven't studied ethics in any classical sense. I'm not going to stand up here and talk about the greatest good for the greatest possible number or right versus right or any of those philosophical constructs. I'll leave that to the people who have studied ethics. What I am is a practitioner, and I've been in software projects, some of them quite challenging, since 1978, which is rather, for some of you, perhaps before your parents were born, certainly before you were. And in testing since 1983. And in that time, I've encountered a number of situations where there were serious ethical challenges on projects. I wrote an article a few years ago called 6 Impossible Things Before Breakfast in Tea Time for Testers. And as a sort of corollary to that, it was about lies. People bending the truth on software projects. And as a corollary to that, I sat down and I listed all of the bendings of the truth that I had heard on software projects. And there were some criteria here. I didn't, not just, any old lie. I excluded things like lies deliberately told to sabotage a single person, that kind of thing. I included only deceptions that I'd heard more than once on more than one project, and that made some material difference of one kind and another. And I did include not just those perpetuated by software practitioners, but also those perpetuated by management and sales. And the list I came up with, and it rather astonished me, I thought it was going to be, maybe 20. I came up with 39 separate deceptions, which said something to me about the world we work in. It's probably not very different from the world at large, but it is a high-pressure world in a lot of ways, and that it creates an atmosphere where often people do practice deception, sometimes just to get somebody off their back. Please go away and let me work. I'll tell you anything you want to hear. And sometimes for advantage. I came up with the 40th one the other day, which I'm not going to go into. Okay. I'm going to ask you to do a little work before we start. I'd like you to turn to the person next to you. We'll do this as a pair exercise. We'll just take 5 minutes. What I'd like you to do is to identify some opportunities for potential ethical concerns in testing, potential issues, at least 3, but as many as you can come up with, and just write them down in your notebook. So, 5 minutes, let's go.
Almost 5 years.
Okay, let's call out 5 minutes. I was waiting for the noise level to go down, but it never did, which is interesting. So either you were heartily engaged in discussing potential ethical lapses or things that you've actually seen or encountered, or you were discussing last night's party, I'm not sure. But I did see some serious faces, at least. I'm not going to ask you to share this. And the reason for that is because a few years ago, I gave a presentation at a conference called What Price Truth When a Tester is Asked to Lie, talking about an experience I'd had on a project where I was asked to falsify results, and in fact put under a great deal of pressure to falsify results, thrown off the project when I refused. I didn't actually get fired because I was working for IBM at the time, and I think they probably, although they weren't happy with me being thrown off a project, they would also not have been happy about me falsifying results in their name. But when I gave the presentation, and I gave it at more than one conference, what I found was, in the open question and answer period afterwards, nobody said anything. And almost immediately after I stopped, a whole lot of people came up. And I heard, this is so timely for me, because it's happening to me right now. Or, wow, I wish I'd had this 6 months ago, because this happened to me. But nobody wanted to talk about it in public. So I'm not going to ask you to. But what I will suggest is that maybe you use this in your thoughts going forward, and also use it to inform any questions or comments you might have in the question and answer period later. Okay, I said I'm not going to talk about philosophical constructs, which I'm not qualified to do. I'm also not going to stand here and tell you, don't tell lies, or don't steal, or any of the things that other 10 Commandments covers. And these are things you know anyway. And it's not for me to preach at you about what your values should be. They're your values. What I am going to do is to talk about some potential survival skills. So, I suggest we start here with understanding what our professional obligations are. And the place that begins is in understanding what we do for a living and how we characterize that. We all have an understanding of that in one way or another. It may or may not be a shared one because there are many communities within the testing community. I'll tell you what mine is. My understanding is that my job, whether I'm testing, whether I'm managing testing, is to discover information about the software and the quality of that software, and to provide that information to my stakeholders so that they can make an informed decision about anything that they need to make a decision about with regard to that software, but particularly about whether to put it into production or not. It follows then, for me, I'm not going to tell you how it should follow for you, but it follows then for me that I get paid to tell the truth. And that's a really important central value for me as a professional obligation. Now, I've peppered this presentation, the slides, with some extracts from the Code of Ethics for the Association of Computing Machinery, which some of you may be familiar with. The reason I picked the ACM Code of Ethics as opposed to some others is because, it seemed to me to be a really good set of values, but also because this is the Code of Ethics that the Association for Software Testing adopted. So, insofar as we have a shared professional organization, this is the Code of Ethics for our professional organization as well. I'm not going to go through all of these because it would take more time than I have, but I'll leave them there in the slides and you can refer to them later. I think I'd like to hit on some of the important points though. And here's one, and it's one of the very basic principles, which is that computing professionals must attempt to ensure that the products of their efforts will be used in socially responsible ways, will meet social needs, and will avoid harmful effects. And they add to that, when we're talking about harmful effects, we're not just talking about human health and welfare and so on, we're also talking about potential damage to the local or global environment. And that's interesting because this was done in 1992, a long time before emission scandals. It talks about excellence, it talks about education. And the next very important obligation they talk about is understanding your legal and contractual obligations. And that covers quite a wide range. It's partly what have you been contracted to do. In the case where I was eventually pressured to falsify results, I had been contracted to manage the testing. I'd been contracted to provide information on that software. But we also have legal obligations sometimes. Some of that is around the legal obligations for the software itself. Are we testing a system in a regulated industry? And so on. And of course, we understand that it's extremely important for us to know what those obligations are. That's an important part of what we need to do when we're looking at software, when we're providing information about software to stakeholders. Does it meet its legal obligations? It's not something that is always taken into account by the programmers. We hope that it will be, but it isn't always. And I've heard of one case quite recently of software written for a government, very important software that was intended to be used countrywide, that did not meet its legal obligations, in fact was collecting money illegally. So this can happen. And I believe that part of the detection of that was by the test manager on the project. And he was instrumental in blowing the whistle on that. So ACM talks about that, but they also talk about the fact that we have to balance any compliance with recognition that sometimes those laws and rules may be immoral or inappropriate. And then we need to think about what kind of action we're going to take. In order to do that, we need to know what it is that we believe. What are your values? Again, I'm not going to tell you what I think they should be. I'll tell you mine. And I apply mine across a number of dimensions, and I think that it's important to do that. Start by saying there are business domains I will not work in. Personally, I will not work on defense software or on armaments. I will not work in gambling. I will not work for a tobacco company. There are possibly others like that, or in places I'm simply not willing to put my time and energy. I'm not going to work for financial institutions who's on software whose only goal is to get people by the short and curlies and hold them there for the rest of their lives with debt. I'm very uncomfortable about that kind of thing. I won't lie. I will not falsify results. I think that's probably true of everyone here. Similarly, I will not falsify plans. I've been asked to do that too. I was asked to come up with a plan which quite different from our real plan, but which made it look as if we were conforming to a plan that we had gone public to the customer with. And I was assured that, we won't hold you to that. Nevertheless, I didn't do it. Partly for my own protection, because I never believe it when somebody says we're not holding you to that. But also simply because, no, sorry, I'm not going to be party to that. So, it's really important to examine your own ethical bottom line. What really matters to you? And keep doing it. Once in a while, revisit it. In whatever circumstances you're in. Look at it in relation to the project you're working on, or in relation to the job you're contemplating applying for. ACM talks about the potential for violating a law, but understanding that even if you do that based on your own ethical considerations, you need to be prepared to accept the consequences. I was once in a position where I thought there was a potential for violating a law. I went to the UK a few years ago to work on a large government project as a test manager. I went knowing the risks, the professional risks. It was a project which was designed to cover most of the IT for the fire service across England. It was intended to do actually it was intended to do far too much, but it was intended to do almost everything from the time the 999 call came in, the emergency call came into the fire service from the intelligent network, to all the way through, deciding what kind of vehicle to send, deciding what kind of equipment to put on, deciding what kind of personnel would be required, dispatching, all of those things, putting a message in the fire station that would go around the walls, and getting the fire station out, the fire appliance and the firefighters out the door within 90 seconds, which has to happen by law, and then tracing all of it. Had huge amounts of data, geographical data, data which would tell the firefighters, because it's also a fire and rescue service, how to cut a particular model of car of a particular year in order to get people out. So all kinds of stuff like that. It had the capability for them to be carrying a mobile terminal, entering data as they went along. So recording all of the history of the incident until its closure. And then it was going to keep data for 7 years. You can imagine that there are some interesting performance implications in that. However, it was at risk. I was the test manager. I was going to be responsible for testing this thing all the way up to user acceptance test. And of course, that involved all kinds of testing. It involved all kinds of levels of testing, all kinds of functional and non-functional testing. We were integrating 53 applications, some of them purpose-built, some of them quite large applications that were being customized for us. So there was a whole lot of risk. And as I said, I saw it as a whole lot of professional risk because failure would have been spectacular. If we'd gone live with major problems, that might have been my career down the tubes. But I really wanted to do it. It was a very interesting project for me, and I had elderly relatives in England, and I was a little bit concerned that if something was going to be rolled out like this, that I wanted to make sure it was tested properly. So that was a risk I chose to take. Almost the first thing they had me do, actually the first day, was sign a version of the Official Secrets Act. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a blanket law that puts people in prison if they tell things that they're not meant to tell. So, understanding that I could have been in a position where if I had to blow the whistle, if my management or the customer had decided to go live with this thing with major problems that they were hiding, I might have felt obligated by my own values and my own professional sense of myself to do something about that, in which case I would have been violating a law and I would have been taking a considerable personal risk. Fortunately, I never got put to the test because we don't really know what we're going to do when we get there. But it was a risk, and it was a risk I chose to accept. Luckily, they canceled the project. I think luckily for the country, not just for me. Okay. We need to know who it is we're serving. We get given lists of stakeholders. I was given a list of stakeholders in that project. I was told very firmly that I was not serving the public. I was not serving the firefighters. My stakeholder was that particular branch of government. That didn't sit well with me. If we're testing a system that could send an ambulance to the wrong, a fire engine, that was another project, that could send a fire engine to the wrong address, or the right address, the right address in the wrong town, or send firefighters out with inadequate equipment, we're risking lives. So it seemed to me that regardless of who I was told my stakeholders were, I was representing the public, I was representing the firefighters, and I wanted all of my testers to understand that too. It's always really important to challenge what you're told about who you're serving. I'll skip over some of this. but except to say that carefully considering potential impacts on all those affected by decisions is how we go about determining whose interests we really are serving and who is most important. Okay. Which takes me to what could possibly happen. We have to know what is the worst our software could do. We have to know what are the most likely harms for the software we're working with. And that's getting harder and harder. It was easy a few years ago when we were dealing with deterministic software, we were dealing with transparent data. It was much easier to understand what the privacy considerations were. Excuse me. It's much harder now when we're dealing with systems with algorithms we can't see inside of. We are dealing with systems which collect vast amounts of data and propagate it all over the place, or potentially propagate it all over the place. How many of you have heard of a company, it's just gone out of my head, Cambridge Analytica? Heard of Cambridge Analytica? Yeah. Cambridge Analytica is a company which has a potent algorithm. They collect large amounts of data, and they provide it to whatever political customer engages them. Except that in the United States, they will only deal with the Republican Party. In the UK, they worked with the Leave side on Brexit. Most of the data they collect is out of Facebook. And one of the ways they collect it is by seeding Facebook with quizzes. You know all those quizzes? What kind of personality are you? Which side of your brain do you think with? If you were a dog, what breed would you be? You know, there's all of these quizzes. People innocently go and do those for the fun of it. I've got 5 minutes, let's waste it here. That data gets collected. It all gets picked up. It's harmless, right? Except that they use it within their algorithm to characterize your personality. And they have, I think, 5 areas of personality that they look at and they categorize. They have said that they have, in the United States, between 3,000 and 5,000 data points on every individual in the US. I think that may be something of an exaggeration because I don't think every individual uses Facebook, but it's a scary number. And of course, those are just data points, right? Except that they have the capability to put them together. And what they are doing is coming up with profiles of individuals. Voter profiles of individuals, not just groups of people, but individuals, and then handing that stuff over to their client, who's using it for ads. In the Donald Trump campaign, it was used to determine who to send what dark posts to. Does everybody know what dark posts are? Negative about the opponent, but also hidden. Dark post, I might target a dark post to you. Say, the example one of the examples that was given in the article was they were targeting gun owners. But depending on whether you were an extrovert gun owner or a traditional values gun owner, you get a different ad. But you wouldn't know what ads other people were getting. On one day in the electoral campaign of 2016, the Trump campaign sent out 100,000 ads to Facebook users. They are believed to have influenced the election considerably. I don't think we can know that necessarily, but it's a scary thought. It's a scary thought that they know that much about you. It's a scary thought that they can use it in that way for you and against you. And against others. It's things like this that we need to be cognizant of. To assess the social consequences of systems, to project the likelihood of any serious harm. So in 1992, the ACM said in their Code of Ethics that computing and communication technology enables the collection and exchange of personal information on a scale unprecedented in the history of civilization. That was in 1992. Nothing compared with the data we have now. the data that's being sent around all over the place. The data that's potentially being collected by code within code libraries that's used ubiquitously in certain kinds of software, and where the designer and the developer of that code library may in fact have set it up in a way that it could collect data and be sending it somewhere that the developers using that code library don't even know about. So we need to think critically about the whole situation we're dealing with, not just the application we're testing, not just the data we know about, not just this particular algorithm, but what about the company we're working for? What are their objectives? Are there unstated objectives? I suspect that that objectives like cheating on emissions tests for car manufacturers wasn't necessarily a stated objective, but it was there. It was there in the zeitgeist somewhere. People knew about it. We need to listen for those things. We need to have our ears to the ground. We need also to be aware of the greater zeitgeist. What are the possibilities for ethical lapses? There are a lot of articles out there. I've put a bunch of references at the end of this presentation, but there are far more articles than I could ever possibly read or list. And I think it's incumbent upon us to keep up with the news of things that can go wrong, uses and misuses of what we create and of what we test, so that we know what to look out for. One of those things that we need to be aware of is inequities. Now again, I have US examples. You may have heard of this one. In the United States justice system, they're currently using a program, algorithm and machine learning directed program, which is used, I hope, simply as a decision support system, but it may in fact sometimes be making the decision. So what kind of sentence a convicted offender should get? It's also used in determining parole eligibility. It turns out that African Americans get longer sentences based on decisions from this algorithm. That's because of the selection of the data that went in. So, you know, big data gets loaded in for machine learning, but that data is selected by someone. I doubt very much that there was deliberate malfeasance and racism in selecting the data so that it would skew against African Americans, but nevertheless it happened, and we need to be aware that that kind of thing can happen. That data is always going to be biased. That's an American example. It's an example of a particular kind of racism in the United States, maybe less prevalent in Europe, but here's another one. What about data that's fed into systems that use an algorithm to do medical diagnostics? There are some cases where women's symptoms manifest very differently from men's symptoms. Heart attacks is one example of that. If the data that's fed into a system like that is predominantly taken from male patients, women are not going to be diagnosed correctly in some circumstances. There are diseases that are racially linked, genetically linked with certain racial lines. Tay-Sachs is one of them. Sickle cell anemia is another. If the data is not properly selected and weighted to go into a system like that, then people in those genetic lines may not be correctly diagnosed. We need to be aware of what that data is. How am I doing here for time? Okay, so I think this is obvious. This is not from any code of ethics, but as all of these things become smarter, due to advances in artificial intelligence, the problem is going to get worse. Because it's becoming more difficult to detect. And it will be difficult for us to detect too, but we are at least on the ground, which is more than the general public is. Okay. We need to learn to say no. Those of you who have children those of us who don't have children but travel on buses or shop in grocery stores, know that every 2-year-old in the world has no problem saying no. You hear it all the time, no! By the time they're 5, it's considerably mitigated. By the time they're 7, it's seriously mitigated. Their parents want them to be obedient, or at least compliant. Their schools want them to be obedient. They come out of school and they go and work for corporations that want them to be obedient and to comply. It's very hard for us as adult human beings to say no, to recapture that inner 2-year-old and say, no, that's wrong for me. I'm not going to do that. But it is something we need to learn. We need to be good at it. And as Alan said yesterday, if you can't do it with genuine conviction, learn to bluff it. Okay, I was talking here about ethical principles taking priority. Beyond saying no, we also learn to tell people things they don't want to hear. Probably most of us do it, at least at some level within our organizations. We know that when we found that a system is not nearly as nice as everybody thinks it's going to be, or it's not nearly as ready for release as the rest of the project is telling everyone it will be, there are times when we have to go a little higher and say, sorry, that's not right. Here's what I see, and back that up with hard data. But that's a very difficult thing to do. It takes practice, and it takes care, and it takes preparation. We need to do those things. We need to learn to do those things adequately. There are lots of resources out there, books on having difficult conversations and so on. I've done a webinar on delivering difficult messages, which you can find, I think it's a Eurostar webinar on the Eurostar YouTube channel. Learn to do it. It's extremely important. Some obvious stuff there. In doing that, we need to know where we're going with it, where to escalate and how high. It's easy to say, okay, the project team's not really listening to me, I'll talk to the product owner, or I'll talk to the project manager, depending on what kind of project it is. They're not listening to me. Where do you go next? Obviously, where you go, how high you go, how long you pursue an issue is entirely dependent, first of all, on how seriously you feel your values are being violated, but also on the risk. With most consumer apps, it's probably not all that important. But if lives are at risk, if huge privacy violations are likely, then where do you go? You need to know that. Within your own organization, of course, first. It may not be the person next in the chain of command. It might be somebody you see as an ally or a potential ally who is in fact outside of that chain of command and who therefore has no vested interest. It might be an internal auditor. Could be all kinds of possibilities. So it's really important to know those and sometimes to know them in advance. If you find yourself in a risky situation or a situation where you think there is going to be risk and potential for violations, you might want to just assure yourself that you know what that escalation path is. The very last resort, and I can't stress this enough, is whistleblowing outside your own company. That's a potential career breaker. You don't want to do that unless you absolutely have no choice. It might have been something I would have needed to do. Thankfully, I never had to consider it with the fire system. Had I had to do it, it's very unlikely I would have gone to the newspapers and had them say, Fiona Charles says this system must not go live. I would have found a different way to do that. And I highly recommend, if you ever find yourself in that situation, you do that too. Ever heard of deep throat? Anyone? Also before your time probably, but a fairly famous case. Turns out deep throat, that man, we didn't know the identity of at the time, was in fact a man called Mark Felt, who was an associate director of the FBI in the United States. He had first-hand knowledge of the investigations, of the violations, and he fed them in nice little dribbits to the reporters, Carl Bernstein and what's his name, the Washington Post. Thank you, Bob Woodward. It's not a bad example of something you might want to do if you ever find yourself in that situation. There are other things you could do. You could go to a member of the opposition party anonymously, depending again on the seriousness of it and the public nature of it. But, as I said, it's got to be a last resort. Okay. And you better understand what your own tolerance for risk is. Because once you start dealing in saying no, dealing in telling people things they don't want to hear, you're putting yourself at risk at some level. Now, I want to emphasize here that just as we have been schooled to be obedient and not to say no, we've been schooled to think that we mustn't step out of line and that horrible things will happen to us if we do. And sometimes those horrible things are not quite real. So it's very important, I think, to do a real risk assessment. What are the genuine risks to me and to others if I take a particular action, if I decide to deliver a particular message or go up an escalation path? What are the real risks? Not, my formless fears that some horrible things will happen, the sky will fall, my children will starve, I will lose my house. Really? In some cases, yes. You might lose your job, you might find it difficult to get another one. But it's important to really think that through. But while you're doing it, don't just think about what will happen if I do this. Think about what will happen if I don't do it. So in some cases, that's even more important. What are the risks to me? What are the risks to my professional reputation if I don't report a violation that I know about? I haven't talked to testers from the diesel division of Volkswagen. I don't know what they knew, if any of them knew anything, but I am immediately prejudiced to say I would not be jumping up and down to hire one of those testers. I suspect that other people feel the same way. So there are risks in acting, there are risks in not acting. It's very important that you analyze what those are. It's also very important that you analyze how much of those risks you can take. If you are genuinely in a position where you can't afford to lose a job or be demoted or whatever else might happen, then maybe you need to move to a position where you're not taking that, where you're not feeling professionally obligated to take that kind of risk. Maybe you shouldn't work on health and safety critical systems until your mortgage is paid and your kids have flown the nest. And then maybe you might want to go back to those. But think about matching your tolerance for risk, your genuine ability to take risk, with risks that you might have to face. Okay. So that's 10 commandments, but I had an 11th, and I decided to put it in as a codicil, which is really a sort of appendix. And that is, if you have concerns, make notes. Keep good, solid notes. On that fire system, because there was always a possibility we might end up in court, I made sure that I had a perfect bound notebook with numbered, the pages were not numbered, but the total number of pages was present in the book. And it would have been obvious had one been torn out, a page been torn out. And I kept very careful notes at the back of the notebook every day. Any disturbing conversations I heard, any decisions I was unhappy with or thought might present a concern. Certainly, when noises were made about faking a plan, I kept very careful notes of all of that. And I dated my notes, and I did them in black ink. It's a smart thing to do. It's a smart thing to do to protect you, And it's a smart thing to do to produce possible evidence if you need it, even if it's just evidence that you're taking to the next level of management. Our memories are often fallible, apart from anything else. So I'll leave you with just one quotation, which is about Bob Mueller, who's been appointed in the United States as the special counsel to investigate any possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian persons who were attempting to influence the election, and Jim Comey, who you may know has been testifying before the Senate as the former head of the FBI. What the article says is that these guys really know what they're doing. They're people who have a very solid reputation for integrity, but they also have a reputation for being very good at being able to exercise that integrity. They document everything, draft memos carefully, enlist allies who matter, and that's always a good thing for us as testers, to have allies. Prosecutors are taught early on to write everything down. The documentation culture is strong within both the FBI and the Justice Department, where words are recorded routinely as future evidence. So that's all I have.
Hello? Yeah. How would you feel if you had worked on a piece of software that had both an ethical and a potentially unethical use case? So I work for the Hydrographic Office, which is a branch of the Ministry of Defence. I didn't work on weapon systems, but I worked on navigational aids.
Yes.
Now, those navigational aids could be used by commercial shipping and private sailors with their own ships and boats and whatnot, but also military craft, which was sold around the world to various navies and whatnot. So how would you feel about a system like that?
I honestly don't know. I'd have to weigh it in the balance. Just about everything we do could be used in some way or another. The question is, what's the likelihood? Yeah. Well, so I might have been uncomfortable about that. I'm not suggesting you should have been, because that's not your set of values, right?
But I wouldn't have worked for BAE Systems who actually make the missiles and weapons.
Right.
So
yeah.
A different choice I would make.
Yeah. And sometimes we have to do that kind of chopping, if you like, as to what does best represent what we feel and what our values are. It's going to be a difficult choice in a lot of circumstances, and it's a very personal choice.
More?
So, in regulated environments, there's normally some sort of an audit process. And I encounter sometimes the feeling of, okay, let's tell the auditor that only if we're being asked. So I wanted to know what are your feelings about that sort of behavior, and where do you draw the line between things that you feel that must be said and things that are okay to let's say, not actively disclose, but not really hide?
That is so context dependent, right? For me, it's going to depend on the risk to a large extent, and on and on motive. If the motive is to hide something that could potentially blow up later, then I'm going to be a lot more interested in simply disclosing it to the auditors. If the motive is in fact benevolent, I feel it's benevolent and fundamentally agree with it. I mean, sometimes there are things that projects are not upfront about because they know they're going to get resolved a little later or whatever, and it's just going to cause a huge ruction and a huge amount of consternation if we go public with them now. So those things are always judgment calls at the time. But it's also a matter of risk, too.
Thanks for a very, very good talk. And my question is about the concerns for leaking informations and confidentiality problems we have. And at the end, what you said about taking notes, as these notes are very sensitive, have you any smart tips how to take notes so that they don't leak or get any?
Lock them up.
Okay. Physically?
Yeah, physically. I mean,
Okay.
I do that routinely with a project notebook anyway.
Okay.
I sit and I do my little debrief with myself at the end of the day, and I don't just document concerns. I mean, I also document things I've learned that day or things that worked or didn't work or whatever. But I always lock my project notebook up at the end of the day. In some cases, I take it home with me.
Yeah, okay. Another risk is like availability or accessibility when your notes are faded or burned up or sometimes it's easier to take electronic notes so that you can make backups, but then you have to have
You're taking a risk.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Right? Particularly if you're using the company's
Yeah, and
equipment.
keeping them on the cloud somewhere.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Do we need to use question assurance? Oh, yeah, yeah.
I was about to ask, but okay. Go for it.
Hi,
Sorry.
I have a little bit different question. You mentioned the user acceptance test for these critical safety systems. I'm always wondering how that is done because I'm not that involved in this. So maybe a few things, just how to do the UAT in such cases. Or who are the persons who do the UAT?
Again, that's really context dependent, right? In this particular case, it was going to be people who were software testers but who worked for the government. My concern in this particular case was that they were not going to have the ability to do the kind of testing we had the ability to do. So, for instance, when I said to my government client that I planned to do extensive scenario testing, and I was going to do all kinds of stuff. We were contemplating doing a 24/7 test with a whole lot of data that would be a combination of load testing and functional testing and so on, and a soak test while we were at it. And he said, "Oh, you don't need to do that. That's we'll do that." But I knew perfectly well they would not have the capability to do that, so I was going to do it. But again, it's so context dependent. You need to know the skills and the what kind of equipment the user's going to have available to them. And again, of course, what's the risk?
Hi.
Hello, Christian.
You just mentioned as well, but one thing I consider in taking part of a project or doing anything is that, well, if I don't do it, there are probably other people who will work on bomb software, gambling, whatever, you name it. And then there's a argument in my head that, well, they might do a worse job in protecting the public from harmful services, for example. So maybe I should be part of that just to make sure that it's done the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's your choice, isn't it? And I said I made the choice and took the risk of going to work on this project in the UK. One of the reasons I knew it was a risk was because I read some of the public data, some of the public information about the project. And, well, first of all, it was a big project. And my experience of big project tells me that big projects are always, and I won't use the swear word, but always seriously messed up. It's just a question of how and whether it's actually possible to help do something about that. So that was one kind of risk. But another was what I felt was the nonsense they were propagating about it. They were going to replace local knowledge with data. I don't think that's possible. And I don't think it's a good idea either. By all means, supplement local knowledge with data. Ensure that data is there to back people up and to enhance their ability to do their job. But don't think you can ever replace human knowledge with data. They're a very different quality of thing. So, in that case, even though I was going to work on a system that I knew had some fraudulent elements, I still felt it was extremely important to do.
But how do you feel about the cases where you actually know that the human decisions statistically are worse than the decisions of, let's say, some neural network or, let's say, indeterministic software?
That's a difficult case, right? I mean, well, I think that say you know that 75% of the human decisions are correct and 25% are not, and we're talking about medical diagnostics. I think there's a case of a system that reads, we were talking about this yesterday, Christian, system that reads x-rays and in fact makes decisions more quickly about what it's seeing, and in fact, and also sees things that the medical technicians are unable to see, makes better decisions. I think that's a no-brainer. I think it's in that case the neural network is preferable, but we develop systems because we can. We don't always develop systems because it's the right thing to do or it's a good thing to do for society. We love technology, and we love to make it even more technology. There's a movement. Nicholas Carr, I think, is a proponent of this. To look at instead of the trend that we've had in developing systems, which is fundamentally to replace humans, or to replace humans performing a particular activity. Why don't we look at enhancing a human's ability to do their job? So systems that help people do their jobs rather than replace them. I mean, one example he gave, and I think it's an interesting one, is in flight systems. The plane is fundamentally flown by all of the systems that are in place to do the automatic pilot. In an emergency, the pilot can step in and take control. But if the pilot is not engaged with flying the plane, there's a risk that it's going to take the pilot too long to absorb enough information to actually do a context switch, to take control of the emergency and do the right thing. It might be better for the pilot to be at least marginally involved in flying the plane, have to do some things all the time. It's a judgment call, I think, but it's an interesting idea about software.
So basically you're recommending to keep people busy even if they're not useful for the moment.
Well, you don't know whether they are, because, yeah, potentially. Why not? How about a self-driving car?
Well, for instance, just to bring you an example, the car that I have has this automatic collision detection. So it will stop when it detects I'm going to hit something.
Yeah.
Especially in like stop and go traffic, where you look around or somebody gives you a ring, and then your attention goes elsewhere, and somebody stops very quickly in front of you. It stops. Unfortunately, it comes with a side effect. When cars are doing left turns on highways,
other cars or your car?
Other cars. Then this system steps in. It detects, well, the car in front of you is stopping, and then all of a sudden you get a hammer-on brake. Everything to the windshield.
Which is it also paying attention to who's behind you?
Well, that doesn't matter. Exactly. That's one point. The second point is that I'm actually at the wheel. I'm looking at the situation, and the software steps in, even though I know I can pass the car from the right.
Yes.
So.
Which would you prefer?
Yeah, I've given it the long thought, and in the long run, this system has actually avoided probably about 3-4 fender benders
that you might have had otherwise.
Yeah. So the car is intact. Family is intact, so far we are safe, but it's bloody annoying.
It's software. How can it be annoying?
Well, we'll take it for a drive, yeah?
Only if I'm in control.
Yeah, good.
So one more question, or it's...
I think the time is up.
Okay.
So, Fiona, thank you for a very interesting speech.
Thank you. Thank you.